This scene at Newport Bridge on the outskirts of Saigon is the proof, if any proof is needed, that the communist forces are finally closing in on the capital. A communist commando unit, probably Viet Cong, has slipped into Saigon and dug itself beneath this American bridge over the Saigon River. They're equipped with grenades, anti-personnel bombs, and AK automatic rifles. Above them, South Vietnamese helicopter gunships circle and fling down their salvo of rockets. While soldiers on the bridge hammer away at them with machine guns and mortar. Much of the American commissary on the other side of the bridge was destroyed in this fighting. An undisclosed number of soldiers were wounded and killed. The communist commandos seemed to fire at anything that moved on and around the bridge, including this small corps of newsmen and women who were foolish enough to get themselves caught in the crossfire. For us, it seemed a good place not to be. Unless something happens very quickly on the political front here, there's every indication that the Battle of Saigon may be about to begin. The soldiers behind me are firing at Viet Cong units who are 500 yards away, no more. This is the closest the fighting has ever come to Saigon since the communist offensive in 1968. Lori Brown, ABC News, Saigon.
The day is April 29, 1975. The final North Vietnamese drive, called the Ho Chi Minh Campaign, proves unstoppable. Within the city of Saigon, fear of communist retribution mounts to near hysteria. When rocket attacks killed 2 Americans, President Gerald Ford orders the final evacuation of the remaining U.S. community of security troops, diplomats, intelligence agents, and their Vietnamese support staff. 6 years later, Tom Jarrell reconstructs America's final hours in Vietnam. Preparing his report, Jarrell interviews eyewitnesses and participants ranging from members of the press corps to the President of the United States, from Southeast Asia to Washington, D.C.
In Washington, President Ford and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, together they directed the last day from the Situation Room in the basement of the White House. In the military, General Richard Carey, the highest-ranking officer on the scene during the evacuation. Major Jerry Berry, the helicopter pilot who logged over 18 hours straight during that last day. Sergeant Juan Valdez, a Marine security guard, the last American to evacuate Saigon. Sergeant Carl Richardson, helicopter crew chief. And Sergeant Raymond Cato, chopper maintenance man. In the press, correspondent Ken Kashiwahara, ABC's last man in Saigon. Jim Laurie, the only American television correspondent to stay in Vietnam after the evacuation. He went back for this 2020 story. Dirk Halstead, Time magazine photographer on assignment in Saigon. David Kennerly, the official White House photographer during the Ford administration. And at the beleaguered American embassy in Saigon, Ken Moorfield, brought to Vietnam as the ambassador's personal aide and put in charge of setting up a formal evacuation center. Denise Pham, a radio disc jockey known as Mother Vietnam, employed as a propagandist by the U.S. Embassy. Frank Snepp, the CIA's chief political analyst in Saigon. And Graham Martin, a career diplomat, whose toughest assignment wound up being the highly controversial ambassador to Vietnam. Finally, Vietnamese who tried to get out but were not evacuated. Phan Tran, a social worker employed by the U.S., and Nguyen Van Hein, an English teacher.
The last day we were in Saigon, April 29th, 1975, was one of the most chaotic of my life. I was blown out of bed as the communists began shelling Tan Son Nhut Air Base.
The North Vietnamese finally let loose with full force. A massive rocket attack on Tan Son Nhut Airport. By morning, whole sections of the airbase were in flames. Planes and buildings burned out of control. And 2 Marines, Charles McMahon and Darwin Judge, were killed at the compound gate. Their deaths rang the alarm bell in Washington, half a world away, where the president was in the middle of meeting with his energy advisors.
Kissinger rushed into his office, said that some American Marines had been killed at Tan Son Nhut. The president then said, "That's it."
President Ford called an emergency session of the National Security Council, at which he ordered the evacuation fleet to be placed on standby, and that Ambassador Martin give him a personal recommendation on what course he should take.
It was a very tense time, and everybody was just totally on edge.
The president then went to the second-floor residence to have a martini and wait for that status report. There would be an uneasy 2-hour delay, waiting for Martin to make contact. Meanwhile, at Tonsonnet, security had broken down completely by the time Ambassador Martin finally arrived to see the damage for himself.
There no longer existed any uniform discipline on the airport.
Looters were tearing apart whole sections of the airbase. At 10:48 a.m. Saigon time, Martin realized there was only one way out.
I called Secretary Kissinger and asked him to inform the President of my recommendation that we not try to proceed further with the fixed-wing evacuation.
Kissinger instantly telephoned the President, who at 10:50 p.m. Washington time gave the order to evacuate by helicopter. 1 minute later, frequent wind was radioed over the command channels. Correspondent Jim Laurie was one of many who then learned the evacuation had begun.
There had been a prearranged signal for the evacuation. It had been disclosed to those in the American community that when the evacuation was imminent, the song White Christmas would be played on the American FM radio station.
That was the signal that they were to start assembling and that the evacuation was commencing.
There were perhaps 200 or 300 journalists and others here at this site. We had heard reports that North Vietnamese were all around the city and they could move in and take the city any time.
When I showed up down there, I guess most of the people from Time Life were there. NBC, ABC, UPI, and AP.
Army buses pulled up, driven by U.S. Marines, fully armed, and each bus was packed with Americans.
A lot of Vietnamese began to gather on the street across from us, and it was deathly quiet. We were all standing out there with our bags and typewriters and cameras. It was obvious we were going to go somewhere, and the Vietnamese obviously knew that we were going to go somewhere, and they looked at us and we looked at them, and there was a lot of looking down at the ground about that point.
Forced to leave much of their equipment behind, the journalist hurriedly boarded the buses.
The bus started off through the back streets of Saigon, and we pulled up behind the embassy.
In all the confusion, the press bus, which was supposed to have headed directly to Tonsonnet, made an unplanned stop at the American embassy.
We were behind the embassy itself, and when people became aware that the bus that was next to the wall had Americans on it, they figured this was a way that they could get out. And people started to bang on the sides of the bus. And they had wire netting on the windows to make sure no grenades were thrown in. And people were hitting on that bus so hard that after a while the netting became covered with blood from people's hands. And finally the Marine who was running the bus said, well, let's get out of here.
Meanwhile, at Saigon's port, getting on a separate evacuation bus, was ABC correspondent Ken Kashiwahara.
As we were pulling out of the port, a Vietnamese man holding a baby ran alongside, and he shouted to us inside. He said, take my baby, take my baby, please. But at that point, he tripped and fell, and the baby fell under the wheels of the bus, and the bus ran over the baby.
All that day at Saigon's port, Vietnamese were desperate, cramming themselves on barges or in a flotilla of smaller boats that headed out into the rough waters of the South China Sea to awaiting American ships. Back on land, as different evacuation buses headed toward the airport, they were faced with one final obstacle. Vietnamese guards at the gate of Tonsonnet refused to let them pass.
The Marines decided they would just rush the gate. They rammed through the gate, managed to get onto the base. You could see black smoke coming up from the Air America facility. Some rockets started to come across the top of the buses. The soldiers got everybody out of the buses, told everybody to bend down low and run into the Defense Attaché's building. All of a sudden, we could see the F-4s come in. They began to rock the North Vietnamese position.
We flew directly into the DAO compound and started to set up for business.
We saw the first helicopters come in, the Jolly Greens, very big Chinooks. They came into this area right next to the DAO. Back ramp went down, and Marines came running off.
Being a crew chief, I'd be up front, and I'd be, waving the people in. And then the first mech would be out the ramp, helping the people up, pushing them in.
People have been told they're only going to be allowed to have one bag apiece. People would wear 3 and 4 suits, trying to get as much as they possibly could out.
People crowded in, and they just want to pick their own spot. That's no way, just get up there, you have to get up there. Sometimes, you'd almost have to step on people so you could get out there and get the people in.
The minute they would get one helicopter full, another helicopter would come in, take its place, Marines would come running out, go into defensive positions, and the process would start all over again.
Even with machine gun cover from overhead, by mid-afternoon, Marines at the airport could no longer contain the crowds. So it was decided to shift the evacuation to the more protected American embassy. Jim Laurie, who had decided not to evacuate with the others, watched the shift from the roof of the Caravel Hotel.
Right behind me, we looked out and we saw the helicopters come in from the South China Sea and pick up people on the roof.
I think I was the first airplane in, first Marine Corps helicopter into the embassy compound. We'd come in over the left side of the building and then drive it in on top of the roof.
Juan Valdez was a Marine guard at the embassy.
I was roving around from place to place. At one time, I found myself at the ground floor, at the parking lot with those people, and at other times, I would go up to the roof and see how that evacuation was going on.
The Marine ground forces were actually in charge on the roof. They were bringing people up through the hatch, and it'd be a matter of a couple minutes, and you'd be fully loaded with anywhere between 15 and 25 people and ready to go.
All afternoon, choppers landed on the rooftop and in the secure compound below, where yellow flares were used to direct the pilots into the landing zone. Automatic rifles were carried by most of those helping with the evacuation, but handguns were taken from the evacuees themselves and tossed into the embassy swimming pool, around which people stood patiently, consolidating suitcases and awaiting their turn on one of the incoming helicopters that would fly them to the safety of an American ship.
Different helicopters went to different ships. As soon as they would set down, the evacuees would run off. The helicopters would be refueled, and they would take off again.
Also flying out to American ships offshore in the South China Sea were small Vietnamese planes and helicopters. Their pilots and crews were fleeing to the U.S. warships for safety at any cost. But none of the Vietnamese pilots could figure out the landing patterns, and they refused to make radio contact.
The air boss is saying, "Please, somebody talk to me." South Vietnamese aircraft are not listening to anybody, and they've got full loads of people on board these aircraft. And they're coming in no matter which way they can get in, as long as they can get on the flight deck. The people jumped off the aircraft and just left the aircraft turning.
The Vietnamese choppers kept coming. Soon they took up so much room on board the U.S. ships, there was only one solution.
We had to throw all of them off the side because we didn't have room for them, because our aircraft were coming in for fuel. 15, 20 people grabbed the nose and rolled it right off the side while the ship was underway. You get a lot of enjoyment in throwing these helicopters over the side because, nobody's in them. And it's a lot of fun to watch how they look when they're sinking. As long as you're not in it.
Other Vietnamese pilots, after dropping off their passengers and being thoroughly frisked themselves, flew their helicopters off the side of the ship and ditched their aircraft in the sea, jumping out at the last possible moment. Again and again, pilots unloaded their choppers this way. And as risky as it was better than the alternative, flying back to Vietnam. Only one crash occurred that wasn't intentional during the evacuation. An American helicopter went down, killing William Neistel and Michael Shin, the last Americans to die in Vietnam. Back at the American embassy, classified documents were being shredded and bagged. At one point, those bags broke open, and the chopper blast sent the paper flying.
We destroyed some of the last files on that last day. All of them were destroyed before we left.
We had an abundance of weapons there. Anything from pistols to shotguns to carbines, M16s, and they were getting ready to blow up these weapons, right in the embassy compound.
All around the building, there were thousands of Vietnamese who had gathered, most of them desperate to get out.
Among those who were not evacuated that day was Phan Tron.
People crowded around the building, thousands of them. They even been crushed or they've been stepped over. And I don't want to be killed that way.
I didn't get in. I myself didn't get in because, but I didn't even get close to the gate either.
Their documentation, I could tell, just in looking at them through the gates, was adequate and sufficient. But we couldn't run the risk of opening the gates and letting in a flood of hundreds.
The gates were open once during the day when Ambassador Martin left the compound to pick up his wife.
I wanted to go back to my residence to give my wife sort of 11 minutes to pack one bag and then to be evacuated from the compound. Although we attempted to go out the gate, the crowds of Vietnamese at the gate made that impossible. They opened the gate, but I think at that point the pressure was so great that they immediately closed it.
As this scene took place in front of the embassy, Martin slipped out the back, picked up his wife, and made sure she was flown out of Saigon.
I did not have any feeling at that time. So I think that's the feeling of most of the Vietnamese at that time. So scared. So we had no more feeling. We felt numbed.
By late afternoon, helicopters carrying an additional security force arrived at the embassy. Marines ran through the compound and positioned themselves along the embassy wall.
The U.S. Marines in combat gear all along the wall and fences, using tear gas and using the butts of their rifles to push and shove and kick and stomp the Vietnamese back over the fence, back out into the streets again.
The only people we could take a chance on taking in were those who either had an American passport or a Western face.
I had been mistaken many times in the previous 2 months for a Vietnamese. So I had this real fear that once I got to the top of the wall, the soldiers and Marines would simply push me back or kick me back, which is what they were doing to the Vietnamese. The only thing I could think of was that if I got to the wall and the Marines started kicking me back down, I was going to shout in perfect American English, "The Dodgers won the pennant."
Marines did not stop Kashiwahara, who scrambled over the wall and into the compound.
All during that period, there were telephone calls, radio calls still from people who were abandoned. You told me to meet you at this particular spot. Where are the Americans? The voices came in over the radios.
We finally got through, and the only thing that we knew and we heard at that time, painfully, was, "Go, good luck."
We did try to take out all those to whom we had a very definite responsibility.
I felt a complete abandonment. I mean, here we are just not nobody off the street. We are part of the work.
They were the people who faced instant death if the communists should move on Saigon, as they did. And as a matter of fact, the proof of all of this is that when they moved on Saigon, one of the first places they went was the Saigon radio station. And they captured one particular announcer who had been left behind, a woman. They tied her to a tree, cut her tongue out, and let her bleed to death.
Hour after hour, helicopters continued picking up loads of evacuees. And as night fell, the choppers kept coming.
The weather began to deteriorate, as it often does near the water and the coast like that at night.
When we got in, started going in there, everything was just dark, except for the lights right there in the landing area. The responsibility that we had was to make sure that the plane was clear of all trees and everything, so we wasn't watching nothing else, just to make sure that when the plane came in for a landing, that it wasn't going to hit nothing.
And I think as the night went on, you saw more and more of these Vietnamese surrounding the embassy building. And I think one of my big fears was that one of the South Vietnamese, Arvin, might think he wasn't getting out and just crank a few rounds off at your helicopter.
To keep that from happening, the embassy security force patrolled the perimeter of the compound throughout the night as helicopters hovered over them.
The president was getting very agitated with Ambassador Martin and kept saying, when is he going to wrap this thing up? Ambassador Martin just kept asking for more choppers, more choppers, more choppers. Finally, the president said, you tell Ambassador Martin to get on that next chopper out of there, and that's it.
Ford's order went out on high-frequency radio. It read, the following message is from the President of the United States and should be passed on by the first helicopter in contact with Ambassador Martin. Only 20 lifts remain. Americans only will be transported. Ambassador Martin will board the first available helicopter, and that helicopter will broadcast Tiger, Tiger, Tiger once it's airborne and en route. The message was received by General Kerry.
Brigadier General Kerry came out and at that time told us that the President said to bring the ambassador out on the next load. And we took off for the embassy.
When the helicopter landed, I was instructed by the pilot to ensure that the first person that got on was the ambassador himself.
He went downstairs, I think he jotted a little note down, went down to the ambassador, and the ambassador appeared in about 15 to 20 seconds with his entire entourage.
He seemed unusually frail as I lifted him up into the helicopter.
As we flew out over Saigon, I had a feeling of enormous relief. One could see the lights outlining the river. One could see one or two flashes of gunfire in the distance. But again, the feeling was one of sort of enormous relief that we had been able to avoid panic.
Martin arrived on the USS Blue Ridge suffering from what turned out to be pneumonia, and so hoarse he had lost his voice completely. The ambassador strode past reporters and headed for his cabin. In Washington, Henry Kissinger called a long-awaited press conference.
Ladies and gentlemen, our ambassador has left, and the evacuation can be said to be completed.
Kissinger, exhausted and relieved it was finally over, left the press conference to get dressed for a black tie dinner at the White House for Jordan's King Hussein.
Everybody was standing around in black tie. And I looked into Kissinger's office, and there he was, pulling a tie out of this paper bag.
What Kissinger did not know was that 10 Marines, the embassy security force, had not been lifted out. In fact, they had just begun closing down the embassy.
So we started moving into the embassy, and they all started charging at us, And we got to the door, and we had to sort of fight our way to get push some of those people out of the way, and finally close the big doors,
Everybody was smiling, and really it had gone very well. Something of that magnitude had been pulled off.
We sealed the doors, both doors, and we went up to the roof through the elevators, and then we locked the elevators up on the embassy roof. There were 2 doors up there that we also had to lock and put trash cans, wall lockers, fire extinguishers, anything to keep them from breaking up there,
As everybody was slapping each other on the back and congratulating one another, word came in that they'd overlooked the final perimeter guards around the embassy. They neglected to remove them from the top of the embassy.
Instantly, a helicopter was dispatched, and at 8:35 in the morning of April 30th, the forgotten Marines were picked up. Juan Valdez was the last to get on board.
I no sooner set my foot on the ramp, and the ramp started going up in the helicopter. I slipped, and then one of the Marines grabbed me and just sort of pulled me inside. And we no sooner started hovering in the air, and then we noticed the Vietnamese had finally broken through that door, and they were already on the embassy roof. By that time, we'd already departed from there.
As the last chopper flew off, 420 fully processed, high-risk Vietnamese were left stranded in the compound, as other Vietnamese swarmed through the embassy, taking away everything the Americans had hurriedly left behind. There would be nothing of value remaining by the time the communist tanks rolled into Saigon 2 hours later and stormed the presidential palace. Nearly 7,000 Americans and loyal Vietnamese were evacuated that last day. The war was finally over. It was an ending perhaps best put by this cable the CIA sent to Washington just hours before. Wish to advise that this will be final message from Saigon Station. It has been a long and hard fight, and we have lost. Let us hope that we will not have another Vietnam experience and that we have learned our lesson. Saigon signing off.